It started out as a normal day. I had just gotten home from running errands when I pulled into my driveway, relieved to finally sit down and relax in my own house. But before I could even turn off the engine, I saw her, my neighbor, Karen, standing at the edge of my property with her arms crossed so tightly it looked like she was trying to keep herself from exploding. I already knew this wasn't going to be a friendly chat. And as soon as I opened my car door, she stormed over, her face twisted in a scowl, demanding to know why I had parked in her spot. Confused, I glanced around, wondering if I had somehow ended up in the wrong driveway, but of course I hadn't. This was my house, my property, and I had parked in the same spot I had always parked in. I calmly told her as much, but she wasn't having it, insisting that the space in front of my garage was a community area and that I was being inconsiderate by leaving my car there, even though it was literally my own driveway. I tried to reason with her, explaining that I had lived here for years and never had an issue, but Karen, with all the entitlement in the world, started waving her hands in frustration, talking about how she knows the rules of the neighborhood and that I needed to move my car immediately. I wasn't going to budge, though. There was no way I was entertaining this nonsense. So I simply told her that my car was staying where it was, and if she didn't like it, that was her problem. That answer didn't sit well with her at all because she huffed, stomped her foot like a child throwing a tantrum, and then pointed at me with an air of self-righteousness that I could practically feel radiating off of her. She then started spouting off ridiculous claims, saying that the HOA had certain regulations about driveway usage, which was laughable because, as far as I knew, this wasn't even an HOA neighborhood. The audacity was astounding, and when I pointed out that she didn't actually have any authority over my property, she acted as if I had personally insulted her entire existence, shaking her head in disbelief as if she couldn't fathom someone daring to question her. At that point, I was ready to ignore her and go inside, but she wasn't done. Oh no. She then switched tactics, trying to make it seem like I was a bad guy, claiming that my car was an eyesore and that it was blocking the view of the street, which made absolutely no sense considering it was parked in my driveway and not obstructing anything. When I told her that she had no say in how I used my own property, her face turned red, and she let out an exasperated sigh before muttering something under her breath about how some people have no respect. Before I could even process what was happening, she spun on her heel, pulled out her phone, and said, "If you won't listen to me, maybe you'll listen to the police." And right then and there, she started dialing 911, acting as if this was some kind of emergency situation. I stood there in disbelief, watching as she loudly explained to the dispatcher that there was a suspicious car parked in the driveway and that she felt threatened by my refusal to move it, completely twisting the reality of what was happening to suit her own dramatic narrative. At first, I thought maybe she was bluffing, but when she gave them my address and insisted that officers be sent immediately, I realized that she was dead serious, actually wasting law enforcement's time over something so trivial and absurd. I could have easily moved my car just to avoid the headache, but there was no way I was giving in to her ridiculous demands, so I crossed my arms and waited, fully prepared to deal with whatever happened next. Karen, meanwhile, stood there with a smug expression, as if she had already won whatever imaginary battle she was fighting, clearly thinking that the police would arrive, see things her way, and force me to comply. Little did she know, she was about to make an absolute fool of herself, but at that moment, all I could do was shake my head and wait for the inevitable showdown that was coming. Karen stood there, arms crossed and an infuriatingly smug expression on her face, as we both waited for the police to arrive. And despite knowing how ridiculous this whole situation was, I still felt a strange mix of amusement and annoyance brewing inside me. I mean, who calls the cops on their neighbor for parking in their own driveway? But Karen, in all her entitled glory, truly believed she was in the right, pacing back and forth while muttering about how people like me think they can do whatever they want, throwing in little remarks about how the neighborhood had rules and how she would not tolerate such disrespect. I didn't even engage at that point. I just leaned against my car, arms folded, waiting for the officers to show up, because I knew that as soon as they heard her complaint, they'd see right through her nonsense. But she was too caught up in her delusions to realize how badly this was about to backfire. It wasn't long before a police cruiser pulled up in front of my house, and two officers stepped out, their faces already showing signs of exhaustion, as if they had a feeling they were about to deal with something incredibly dumb, and they weren't wrong. The moment they arrived, Karen marched up to them with the confidence of someone who thought she had the law on her side, pointing aggressively at my car while speaking in the most dramatic tone possible, acting as though she had just witnessed some horrific crime unfold right in front of her. "Officer, I need you to remove this vehicle immediately," she exclaimed, as if this was some kind of life-or-death emergency. Then she proceeded to rant about how I was trespassing on her space and causing a disturbance in the neighborhood. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with the kind of patience only years on the force could provide, raised an eyebrow and calmly asked, "Ma'am, can you clarify? Where exactly is the car parked?" Karen gestured wildly toward my driveway, looking at them as if they were supposed to already be on her side. But when they followed her gaze and saw my car parked neatly in front of my garage, their expressions shifted from neutral professionalism to sheer confusion. "Ma'am, this is his driveway," the officer stated matter-of-factly, and Karen immediately shook her head, insisting that it was actually shared property and that I was violating neighborhood regulations. The second officer, a younger guy who looked like he was doing everything in his power not to roll his eyes, took a step forward and asked, "Sir, do you have proof that this is your property?" I nodded, already expecting that question, and without hesitation, I pulled up the property deed on my phone, showing them clear documentation that I was, in fact, the legal owner of both the house and the driveway. The older officer glanced at the screen, nodded, then turned back to Karen, his voice carrying a sharp edge of impatience now. "Ma'am, this confirms that the driveway belongs to him, so he has every right to park his vehicle here." You'd think that would have been enough to shut Karen down, but no. She doubled down, shaking her head furiously and insisting that she had lived here longer and that everyone knew there were unspoken rules about parking. The younger officer, clearly over it at this point, let out a deep sigh and said, "Ma'am, there's no law against someone parking in their own driveway. You can't just make up rules because you don't like it." But Karen wasn't letting go that easily. She huffed and threw her hands in the air, looking from one officer to the other as if she couldn't believe they weren't siding with her. "But it's an eyesore," she whined, switching tactics yet again. "It ruins the aesthetic of the street. It lowers property values." The officers exchanged glances, and I could tell they were on the verge of either laughing or telling her off, but instead, the older one simply shook his head and said, "Ma'am, none of that is illegal." Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red, and she opened her mouth like she was about to argue again, but the officer wasn't having it. "Unless you have a valid legal reason why this man can't park here, this is not a police matter," he stated firmly, making it clear that this conversation was over. I thought that would be the end of it, but Karen, unwilling to accept defeat, stomped her foot and demanded, "So you're just going to let him get away with this?" That was the moment the younger officer finally lost his patience, pinching the bridge of his nose before saying, "Ma'am, there is nothing to get away with. You called us out here for a non-issue. You wasted our time. If you continue harassing your neighbor over something that isn't against the law, then you'll be the one facing consequences." That shut her up real quick, and for the first time since this whole ridiculous encounter started, I saw a flicker of realization cross her face, like it was finally sinking in that she wasn't going to win this battle. Still, she couldn't just walk away quietly. Karen being Karen, she had to get in one last passive-aggressive jab, muttering under her breath about how some people just don't belong in this neighborhood, before turning on her heel and stomping back toward her house, slamming the door behind her. The officers turned to me, and the older one gave me a tired nod before saying, "Sorry you had to deal with that, sir. You're not doing anything wrong. Have a good day." I thanked them, watching as they got back into their cruiser and drove off, leaving me standing there shaking my head in disbelief at the sheer pettiness I had just witnessed. But as ridiculous as the situation had been, I had a feeling this wasn't over yet. Karen didn't seem like the type to let things go, and sure enough, she was about to dig herself into an even deeper hole. Even though the police had made it clear that I was well within my rights to park in my own driveway, Karen wasn't about to let things go that easily. I had barely stepped back into my house when I heard her outside, still fuming, ranting to someone on the phone about how the officers refused to do their job and how she was going to take this to the highest authority. I sighed, shaking my head because at this point it was just sad. She was so determined to control something that had nothing to do with her that she was willing to humiliate herself in the process. Over the next few days, she went on a full-fledged campaign to try and turn the neighborhood against me, knocking on doors, stopping people in the street, and telling anyone who would listen that I was disrupting the community by parking in my own driveway. She even went so far as to print out fake HOA violation notices. Mind you, we didn't even have an HOA and left them taped to my garage, thinking I'd actually fall for it. I knew it was her because the paper still smelled like her overpowering perfume, but instead of confronting her, I decided to document everything. Every fake notice, every weird interaction, and even the security footage from my doorbell camera showing her sneaking onto my property in the middle of the night to leave her ridiculous warnings. It was all starting to become more pathetic than infuriating, and I figured if she kept pushing, she'd eventually cross a line she couldn't come back from. And sure enough, she did. One afternoon, I was outside watering my lawn when I heard a loud scraping noise, and when I turned around, I saw Karen standing there with a can of spray paint in her hand, furiously shaking it as she prepared to deface my garage door. I don't know what she was planning to write, but she had that unhinged determination in her eyes, the kind of desperation that only comes from someone who knows they've already lost but refuses to admit it. The moment she realized I had caught her red-handed, she froze, then tried to play it off like she was just inspecting the area for damages. I pulled out my phone, hit record, and said, "Go ahead, explain to the cops why you're on my property with spray paint in your hand." That was all it took. Her face drained of color, and she stammered some weak excuse before speed-walking back to her house like a cartoon villain who just realized their plan had failed. But I wasn't about to let her get away with this one. With all the evidence I had gathered, I decided to take legal action, filing a report for harassment and trespassing. When the police showed up at her house, she tried to play the victim, sobbing dramatically about how she was just looking out for the neighborhood and how I was bullying her by calling the authorities. But the officers weren't buying it this time. They had already dealt with her nonsense once before, and now that there was concrete evidence of her crossing legal boundaries, they had no choice but to issue her a citation. It wasn't enough to land her in jail, but it was a serious enough consequence that she finally realized she had overplayed her hand. From that moment on, she avoided me like the plague. No more confrontations, no more fake notices, no more passive-aggressive comments. It was as if she had suddenly remembered that she had better things to do, though in reality, she was probably just embarrassed that her antics had backfired so spectacularly. And the best part, word spread fast in the neighborhood, and soon enough, everyone knew about her meltdown, her false police call, and her pathetic attempt at intimidation. The same people she had tried to turn against me now saw her for what she really was, a miserable busybody with too much time on her hands. Over time, the looks of sympathy she used to get from the other neighbors turned into looks of annoyance, and eventually, she became the very thing she had accused me of being, an eyesore. A couple of months later, a for sale sign appeared in front of her house, and within weeks, she was gone, disappearing just as dramatically as she had entered my life. Whether she moved on to a new neighborhood to continue her reign of pettiness elsewhere, or finally learned her lesson, I'll never know. But what I do know is that ever since she left, the street has been a whole lot quieter, and I've been able to park in my own driveway in peace.